Chris Anderson in the ether. Where are you?
I am in ether. Well, as I speak now, I am in Paris. But as you view this, I'm going to be in Amsterdam because I've run short of stroop waffles and I have to go get
Oh
some.
my gosh, a stroop waffle shortage has
It is.
struck
It's
Chris
crisis.
Anderson.
That's
And
right.
if you guys don't know what stroop waffles are, look it up, check it
You
out.
haven't lived.
You
Yeah.
haven't lived, and your blood sugar hasn't gotten as high as it can get.
Yes. So that
Well,
means that we're not in the studio. Where are you? You're
no,
still in Chicago.
I'm in Chicago. Actually, I'm in Chicago as I speak, but I'm in East Point, Michigan, as you're watching this, giving a speech about the Ghost Army. So cheers to that. And
So you finally got to do your very first speech about the Ghost Army.
I don't even know what to say. I don't know that much about it. I'm
I
a
know.
little. I feel like I'm not quite going to be ready to handle that. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, an encore episode brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. And Chris and I, we're traveling the globe, but darn it, we're also trying to be here with you to have a cocktail, talk about history. And today we're going to bring back a great show from almost 2 years ago about the French Resistance. But Chris, before we do that, just a mention of our top shelf patrons,
Yes.
right? And we do appreciate all of you guys. Look, the list has evened
I was
out.
going to say the symmetry is beautiful.
Yes, but I want you to know we can go to smaller font.
Absolutely.
We can go
Look
to
at how small the font is of the History Happy Hour on the top right hand corner.
I
That
know.
small would be great.
No, but we can go to multiple pages too. So if you want to
Um,
become a top shelf patron or a patron at any level, and we appreciate all of our History Happy Hour patrons, join us at patreon.com/History Happy Hour. And Chris, also want to mention, if people have forgotten about this, that we're also now a podcast.
We're so high speed.
We're out there, man. We are the History Happy Hour podcast. Same great shows, same questionable hosts, is now available on Apple, Spotify,
Are you
other
going to start
places.
doing like history influencer? So you like show history fashion and
Well, I
inspire
already think
historians
everything
everywhere?
we have like, and read this book because it's so great. Yes,
Okay.
I'm a history influencer or hinfluencer as we don't ever
Don't
say.
say.
Okay, so please let
Enjoy
us
the
know.
show.
Yeah, please let us know, everybody, where you're watching from, and talk to each other because we're not really here. And but we have a terrific show that came on 2 years ago with Lynne Olsen, one of our favorites, and talking about the great female French resistance leader, Marie-Madeline Fourcade.
Okay. Yes.
So I think that it'll be fun. And maybe you saw it, but if you did, it was 2 years ago, you probably don't remember it. And so maybe you didn't see it. And if so, here it is. Chris, give us the drum roll. All right, the bar is open. And before we bring Lynn on, we have been doing this 17 weeks. Did you realize that?
I did not realize that. No.
17 weeks. So I wanted to just show what's happened to us over at that time. So this is week 1. Here we are.
I can see my ears.
We're serious young men on a mission. And here we are now by about week 15, I think is the last photo. So significant hair growth.
Yes.
But we look happier.
We do? Okay,
We
good.
do. Maybe goofier. I'm not
Goofier.
sure which it is, but in any case, we have aged over this time, and we'll keep this going so that we can see how it continues over the weeks.
We'll reach the point where the long hair just falls out and then I'm bald. Yeah.
There you go. So our topic and guests today are really close to my heart. I've been a fan of Lynne Olsen's for more than 20 years, since I read The Murrow Boys, which she co-authored with her husband, Stanley Cloud. Lynne's a New York Times best-selling author with, I think, 8 books, history books, many of which have to do with World War II and Britain's role in World War II. And some of those titles include Citizens of London, Last Hope Island, Those Angry Days, and a book that made a big impact on you, Chris, A Question of Honor, about the
Balls.
about the Kosciuszko Squadron. Former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who is not here with us today, has called Lynne our era's foremost chronicler of World War II politics and diplomacy, and many of her books grace my shelves here in Chicago, including her most recent one, Madame Fourcade's Secret War. And so it is a great pleasure for us to welcome today Lynne Olsen. How are you?
I am fine. How are you?
Excellent. Great. Lynne, did you bring a cocktail?
I did.
What'd you bring? Wine. Wine. Excellent. Wine. Oh, we're all in the same.
In the spirit of things.
Two reds and one white.
Yeah. Oh, you gotta cover your bases.
Well, we're thinking of France. I did go out and made sure to get a French wine. It's only a little, table wine, but it'll do. It'll do.
Nice. Yes.
So the subject of your book and the subject of our show today, Marie-Madeline Fourcade, at age 31, became the leader of one of the largest and arguably one of the most important resistance organizations in France during World War II, the Alliance, or I'm sure the French say Alliance or some such thing. And I first heard her story some years ago, staying at this amazing bed and breakfast in Normandy, Manoir Canet, run by her son, Jacques Fourcade, and his wife, Alix. And we have been there many times over the years, and it's a wonderful, wonderful place. And I was so excited, Lynne, when I heard, when Jacques told me, actually is how I first heard of it, that your book was coming out, excited that this story would become much more widely known. And so I wonder, tell us a little bit about your subject, Marie-Madeline Fourcade, and how you came to write about her.
I really found out about her when I was doing research for the book I wrote right before Madame Fourcade's Secret War, which is called Last Hope Island. And that book is about the relationship between Britain during the war and the occupied countries of Europe. And in doing that book, I had already done a lot of research about resistance movements in the various countries, but I did a considerable amount more research about it. And in doing that, that's when I found out about Marie-Madeline. I had never heard about her before. I had never come across her name before. And during that research, I not only came across her name, but I came across the extraordinary things she did. And the fact that she was the only woman to head a major French resistance organization during the war. And I thought that's extraordinary, that I had never heard of her. And so I looked into it some more. And after Last Hope Island came out, I was looking for a new subject. And this is the first book that I've written that's been only about one person. I mean, it really isn't. It's about Alliance. It's about the French resistance movement as a whole. It's about their relationship with Britain. I mean, it's about a lot of other things, but I have one key character, which I've never had in any other book. And the reason is that her story was so incredible.
Yeah.
That, I decided she really deserved a book of her own. So that's how I mean, she's very similar to some of the other people that I've written about in some of my other books, which are, I like to look for unsung heroes, people that, haven't gotten the credit they deserve for whatever things that they have done that of note. And in fact, most of my books have that as a feature, at least one unsung hero. And she is definitely, in my opinion, an incredible unsung hero. I mean, people in France do know about her to some degree, but certainly very few people in France know about her.
Rick, for you?
Chris.
No, okay. Well, one of the things that struck me, I mean,
we'll figure this out eventually. 17 weeks in, but still, Lynne, we're still working on the routine, but we're getting there. Okay, honestly,
I'm sure we'll get to the fact, just the thing about her being the only woman involved in intelligence, because I do want to get to that. But one of the things that really grabbed me was, how she gets involved in this. And I'm going to use the code name because it's the one I remembered as I was reading the book, but her relationship with Navarre, and even before the war, they're saying something's not right here, which, now, of course, we know how it all plays out. But at that point, nobody could have imagined that France would be in that position.
Right. Yeah.
How does somebody who's a kind of a upper middle class French woman, not brought up, how does she find herself involved in intelligence and raising the alarm before the war even starts?
It's an incredible story. She was not actually raised in France. Her father was a shipping executive, and she was raised in Shanghai. And I think that really influenced her. Oh, I know it really influenced her, but I think it really influenced her personality, because you're right. She came from a haute bourgeoisie family. I mean, she was really upper middle class, or, she wasn't aristocratic, but she was the next best thing. And so, young French women did not have the kind of upbringing she had, which was in Shanghai. She was allowed to do a lot of things that she could never have done in France. I mean, her parents were quite free-spirited. And so Shanghai was a real, it was a center of excitement and intrigue during this time. We're talking about the early 20th century. Lots of drug smugglers, gangsters, Bolsheviks, White Russians. I mean, it was an incredible place. And she loved it. She had a spirit, I think, of adventure, and she craved it, I think. And, of course, if she'd been raised in Paris, that probably wouldn't have happened. So that really influenced her. She came back, and she had this real love of France that was quite unrealistic, I think, having not grown up in France. So when she came back, her father died, and her mother and her siblings, and she came back to Paris, and she went to school there. And then she married very early, before she was 18. She fell in love with a young French military intelligence officer and married him. And I think one of the reasons she did is because he was about to be sent to Morocco, which was another place of excitement, adventure, and danger. And so she went off to Morocco and was married not all that long. She had 2 children almost immediately. But she did not like being married. She did not want to be a wife and mother. He was very traditional Frenchman. He wanted her to be at home with the kids and just take care of the kids and him. And that wasn't her idea of her life. And so she left him, still in her 20s, and went to Paris. So she was, right from the beginning, she was not an atypical French woman. She rebelled against the whole idea of that women were, supposed to be confined to their domestic roles. And she refused all her life to go along with that. So that, I think, had a big influence. She met Navarre, this French military intelligence officer, shortly, about 4 years before the war began in the 1930s. And he was very anti-German. He thought that the Germans, that the French should be strengthening their military forces against Germany, and not appease Hitler, as the French were and the British were at that period. And so he started his own private intelligence agency spying on the Germans. And he enlisted Marie-Madeline in this effort even before the war began. So she was starting to learn how to be, a spy even before the war came along. And so they were busy with this private intelligence, and he was getting intelligence from all over, and he would publish it, in articles, talking about the German buildup in planes and, in the army, what they were doing. So, that's her background, before the war actually began and before they actually began this network.
Right. So
she was assisting Navarre, his code name, and essentially he's arrested eventually, and or unable to keep leading. She takes over, She is, I think, very young, like 31 years old at that
31,
point.
yeah, when she took over in 1941.
She's in a society which obviously is a very conservative society, not really necessarily open to young women being leaders of large organizations, especially what is in essence a military and intelligence organization.
Right.
So how did that play out? How did she manage? I mean, how the heck did she manage to do that?
That is such a good question, and I've wrestled with it since I started the book. Well, first of all, she was his deputy. The network Alliance was actually created in Vichy. They went to Vichy after the French capitulated, and after the collaborationist government, the Vichy government moved to Vichy. The French government moved to Vichy. And so Navarre and Marie-Madeline went there because Navarre told her, this is where all the intelligence is. We've got to find out what's going on there. So they ended up there, and she was his deputy. He made her his deputy, which was an incredible thing to do. Again, just going back to what you said about women's role in France, that was just unthinkable that he would do it, but he did. And so she was his deputy right from the beginning. So she was really the one who had the hands-on relationship with the young men, mostly young men in the beginning, that they recruited as agents. She was the one who taught them how to code, how to do their job. She was the one that gave them money, found them places to live, found them places to hide. So she was involved in all that, the kind of administrative, logistical stuff. So they got to know her in a way that they did not know Navarre, and who was up there big dealing it with Pétain, actually spying against Pétain, but big dealing with him. So Marie-Madeline, that was her role. So that's how she learned to be a intelligence network leader as well. But it still doesn't answer the question that you asked. How did she do it? It's a question that I asked everybody that I interviewed. How did she do it? And what came across to me from what people said was that she was just an extraordinary person, that she had an aura of authority about her. She was really beautiful by all accounts. She was a beautiful young woman, but she had this incredible aura of authority that made military men, agree to her as their leader, which is, I interviewed, there were a couple of people that I thought were really good in trying to explain what she was like. And one of them was the son of one of her top lieutenants during the war. And I was interviewing him in Paris, and he said, actually, he is her godson. And so he knew her from, the time he was very young. He said that if you walked into a room and she was there, the only person that you focused on was her, that she had this extraordinary charisma that just took over. And he said he was scared of her. I mean, that he was, really in awe of her all the time when he was growing up. But that she just had this, this thing about her that made people really respond. He also said to me, and I think in many ways this explains her more than anything else that I heard about her. He said she didn't operate according to society's rules. She operated according to her own rules. Basically, she acted like a man. And I think that's, she refused to be put into any kind of box that said woman on it. I mean, she was herself. She knew herself. And, as I said, she was just so extremely charismatic that she brought all these people along with her. And again, most of them throughout the war were men. She brought in a large number of women later on, but most of them, the first recruits were former military men. I mean, they were a lot of them had been in the Army, a lot of them had been in the Air Force, and some in the Navy. So it's a question that I can't really answer. I think, you know, you'd have to know her to be able to really kind of get the maybe the feeling of why she did it, but there's no question she did. And she was a true leader.
You know, when you say that, and it reminds me oddly of Joan of Arc. You know, you have the sense that there must have been some, you know, there must have been something about Joan of Arc, right, that made people willing to go along with her. Same kind of deal.
Well, I was going to say, when I was reading it, I thought a lot of Major Winters from Band of Brothers, who I knew really well, and I would just see him walk into a room, even before the fame of the movie, and everybody would stop talking, and he was there, and he just commanded the room immediately.
Yeah, there are people like that. I mean, I haven't run into a huge number, but I have some that are just that are extraordinary. You can't really explain.
Right.
They just are there. I mean, they just have it. And she did.
Well, one of the things that I kind of struggle with the guests, the people I talk about, is a lot of Americans have a very kind of skewed view of France during World War II and French history and what happened. And one of the things that I think our listeners would benefit from is kind of getting your thoughts on what is the resistance, because, you know, there's no one resistance head, and so I think to help our listeners understand what we mean when we say the resistance.
Yeah, the resistance really in all countries was very amorphous. I mean, the resistance is kind of a catch-all term for rebellion against the German occupiers. In France, there were. It's very complex in France. I mean, there were resistance networks and resistance movements, and resistance networks tended to be active, to be actually doing something. And I'll talk about the various kinds of resistance networks in a second. And then there are the resistance movements where people are against the Germans, but they may not be doing anything. In other words, they may not be collecting intelligence or being involved in sabotage. They may be, you know, putting out underground newspapers, but they're not actively fighting, you know, doing something active to resist the Germans. When I talk about the networks, in the book, I talk about three different, first of all, the networks, there were hundreds of resistance networks all over France. There were some major ones, and then there were some very small ones. So, you know, Marie-Madeline's intelligence was not the only one by any means. I mean, there were a lot of intelligence networks. It happened to be one of the biggest and one of the most influential, most important, but there were many, many. And I basically break it down into three important kinds of missions that these resistance networks did. One is the one that I think most people know about, or if they know anything about the French resistance, and it's the one that gets the most attention from books, from movies, and that's sabotage. The overt rebellion, the overt fighting against the Germans. So that's sabotage. Then there are escape lines, you know, where resistance members help, for example, downed Allied flyers to escape from the country and get back to Britain, and that was a big deal too. But the third, and those two probably have gotten more attention, again, in terms of actual history, but also in terms of movies, books, novels. But the third one was really the most important, and that was intelligence networks. And the reason for that is that the Allies needed information about the Germans and their presence, military presence in these various countries, needed it desperately for their own offensive and defensive activities against the Germans. So they needed to find out what the Germans were up to in all these countries and what they were doing, and especially for France. France was incredibly important for the Brits because obviously it's the occupied country closest to England, which means that especially early in the war, that's where where German planes were based. Most German planes were based. The ones that bombed London and other British cities during the Blitz. The ones who, basically tried to knock out British defensive capability in the Battle of Britain. They were based in France. So it was vital for England to know about them. Also, the German submarines that were, active in the Battle of the Atlantic, trying to strangle British supply lines, their submarine bases were in France. So it was absolutely essential for the Brits to know what was going on in France. And so the intelligence networks were important from the very first day of the war to the very end of the war. And Marie-Madeline's network supplied an extraordinary amount of important military intelligence to the Allies, both to the Brits and the Americans. But it's also unique in that it was created in the 3 months after France capitulated in 1940. One of the earliest intelligence networks, one of the earliest networks, period, to be created, and it lasted until the end of the war, which was really unusual because the Germans were incredibly good at finding and ferreting out these resistance networks and basically crushing them and executing many of the people.
That's something I wanted to ask about, and I want to remind everybody that we're talking to Lynne Olsen, author of Madame Fourcade's Secret War and many other books. And I want to encourage you to post any questions that you have, and we'll get to them starting in a few minutes. But Alliance was a big organization, thousands of people, and reading the book, you get the sense of this war on Alliance that the Gestapo is fighting, and kind of waves of death is the only way I can describe it. And you describe the different waves of people who worked for the organization, and the agents who started at the beginning, not very many of them survived, and there had to be new waves of people, and the Gestapo is constantly on them, constantly trying to annihilate them, to liquidate them, and hundreds of people didn't survive, and she was haunted by those deaths, wasn't she?
She was incredibly affected by those deaths. She really looked on her intelligence agents as if they were her own children. I mean, remember, she was very, very young. She actually had 2 young children that were alive during the war. They were in, I think 9, when the war began, they were 9 and 6, I believe. And she saw them very, very rarely. She saw them maybe 2 or 3 times during the war. But she thought of the people that worked with her and for her as her children, as part of her family. And so she helped build this organization up. So many of the people who were with her in the beginning, when there weren't that many people, she was incredibly close to. And so when they started getting arrested, and then when she learned of their executions, it just threw her for a loop. I mean, she was just devastated. And she talks about in her memoir, she talks about how every time she heard of another arrest or another death, and she had to mark it, she had a list of her agents and mark that person out. She said it was like she was wielding an executioner's axe. She was just heartbroken. But the thing is that she kept doing it. I mean, she kept it together. And she was the one that did it. She was the one that kept it together. When whole sectors were wiped out by a Gestapo purge, then she would, find other people and send them in there. And as I said, it survived, until the end of the war. It was an extraordinary a bit of leadership on her part.
Can I ask my question, Rick, or do you want to pipe in another question?
No, you go in, and I'll bring in some of our questions from viewers.
All right. Well, one of the other things that struck me, I mean, I had a pretty good general sense of French resistance movements and what was involved, but the politics behind keeping her network going. So she's not only dealing with the Gestapo, but she's dealing with communists and De Gaullists and SOE and MI6. And one of the things that I think makes Alliance unique too is she's not in the communist camp. She's not a de Gaullist. So what do you think it is that why she said no? MI6, that's the agency I'm reporting to. They're running. You know, why did she kind of separate herself out from that whole, the politics of?
Well, MI6 initially when Alliance was getting started, Navarre, his real name is Georges Lousteau-Lecault, but it's much easier to say Navarre. Navarre went to. They needed money. They needed money to be able to not only to keep this infant network going, but to expand it the way they wanted to. So they went to both de Gaulle, who had just gone to England and was founding the Free French movement, and they went to MI6 basically to be funded by, and so they were fairly open. I actually don't think Navarre was all that open. Navarre was an old colleague and rival of de Gaulle's, and I think it was pretty obvious they couldn't stand each other. And so I think Navarre did everything he could to make sure that de Gaulle wouldn't be the one that would fund them. Right. And in fact, when de Gaulle got this letter from Navarre, he said, basically, anybody who is not for me is against me. That was de Gaulle's whole modus operandi, that you had to be totally loyal to de Gaulle. You couldn't work for anybody else or help anybody else. And the Brits were just thrilled to have this, fledgling network run by a very experienced military intelligence officer. So they immediately, MI6, the intelligence agency, immediately said, yes, we will pay for it. And not only that, we will send you radio sets and we will give you all this stuff. So right from the beginning, MI6 was their sugar daddy. I mean, and so they were incredibly close to MI6. And Marie-Madeline was really loyal. She hated this whole, the political stuff. The French are incredibly political, and they were very political during.
No,
right.
I did not know this.
Well, I knew that, but I didn't realize the extent and the depth of rivalries and antagonisms there were. And she just insisted. She tried very hard to stay out of all that, and she kept saying, we're supposedly fighting the Germans, not each other. But in fact, many times they were fighting each other more than the Germans. But she remained loyal to MI6 right till the end, and she tried very hard to stay out of the politics, and she couldn't eventually. I mean, she dragged into it, but she really did think that her and Alliance's main function was to report on the Germans, not to get involved in these feuds that were going on all the time.
She was kind of unique in that regard amongst the French resistance.
Yeah, she really was. I mean, I think that part of it is because she was a woman. All these guys were not only
outsider, right?
Well, she was an outsider, but all these guys were thinking about post-war. They all had their eye on that right from the beginning, and about their role in the post-war world. She never, as far as I saw, she never had any idea about her being, having a big role in post-war France. She didn't. I mean, she was really focused on the war and getting the Germans out. She hated the Germans. She just wanted them out of her country, and she was going to do anything she could to get them out.
So I'm going to bring in a question from our audience, and maybe Chris, you can look at the other questions and find another one to bring in after this one. Because this is not the oldest question here that's come in, but it's a good question. Neil Shara asks, can you speak about the extraordinary map of Normandy that was flown to England? And this is a map that her organization created of the potential landing beaches, right? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. Yes, it was this. It was 1943, so the Allies were already planning D-Day. And Alliance, along with a lot of other French intelligence organizations, were asked to come up with maps and other information about the beaches. They hadn't decided yet by this time, I think maybe they had decided on the D-Day beaches where they were going to be in Normandy. But anyway, it just so happened that the subsector of Alliance that covered those beaches was run by a sculptor and artist named Robert Douin, and he knew a lot of. Obviously, he grew up in that area, and so he had a band of, I guess, about 20 people, fishermen, teachers, various other occupations that were spying, but he did the bulk of the work for this map. He would go out with his son, and they would bicycle and walk up and down, and he would sketch. I mean, he was an artist, so he would sketch, and then they would try very hard to stay away from sentries. But he had access to the bell towers of churches in the area because he had done a lot.
He worked on them, right? He did.
Yes, he had done some work on them, and so he could go up in those bell towers and not be observed by any sentries, and would have this, panoramic view of what became Utah Beach and
Omaha and Juneau and Ford.
Yes, exactly, all of them. And so he took all that in, made sketches, and in the end, it was his masterwork. He had a 55-foot long map of the beaches, the actual beaches that the Allied troops landed on D-Day, along with information about the German troop presence, etc. You can just imagine a 55-foot map, canvas map, and it was rolled up and put into a big sack and sent to London by RAF, small RAF plane, in March 1944. And Douin had already been told that the Gestapo were on his trail, but he insisted on continuing. And in fact, MI6 said he should get out and come to London, but he said, no, I'm going to finish this. So he finishes it. It gets sent off to London. Marie-Madeline is in London at that point. She takes it, gets it, and then sends it immediately to the War Office. He is, I think, just a couple of days later, he and 15 of his agents are arrested by the Gestapo. And the morning of D-Day, as the naval guns are booming off the coast, and so many of the troops have maps in their hands that, were based to some extent, to a large extent, on that map that Douin and his agents put together. He and the 15 agents were taken out of their jail cells, and they were shot in the courtyard. They were killed, and their bodies were put into a truck, and nobody knows where they were buried. So he sacrificed his life for it, but it was an incredible. It was really, really important. There was other information from other networks, but it was by far the most complete map of the coast and of the landing sites, and nobody knows where it is.
That was my question, because when I read the book, I was like, "Where's this map?" I'm googling 55-foot map.
55-foot map. God only knows. MI6 is, as you know, Chris, and Rick, they're still classified. You cannot get any information from them unless they want to give it to you. And I'm not the only one who is asked. I mean, there is an organization that was started by Marie-Madeline. It's called Alliance, still in France, and they've tried to find it, track it down. Nobody seems to know. Nobody has any idea if it still exists. There's no record of it at all.
Someday the map will turn up.
Someday it will. It'll be like Citizen Kane, like Rosebud.
Well, I mean, one of the things that's so amazing about D-Day, and Alliance has got a huge part to play in this, is there's never, given the complexities of the invasion and what was at stake, there's never been a commander. Eisenhower knew everything about the Germans. He had their entire order of battle. He knew how many tanks there were, other than, I think, a couple of smaller ancillary units. He knew exactly what he was going up against, and that was, in part that was, through Alliance. And I remember reading and about Eisenhower's getting requests before the war to get the French involved. The resistance wants to get involved and blow things up. And Eisenhower says, that's not your job. That's my job. Your job is to tell me who's there.
Yeah.
Eisenhower saw that it was the intelligence part of the equation that was the important one.
He did, but actually the sabotage people actually played a role as well after D-Day. But you're right. I mean, in order for D-Day to be the success it was, it needed everybody, and I don't think a lot of people realize how important the French were, the intelligence networks, in providing information, not only about D-Day but about a lot of other things too. But they really did play an important role, and I think the French kind of get short shrift sometimes. People, the resistance. There's been a lot written saying that they really didn't accomplish much. It wasn't worth the number of people that died, etc. I don't think that's true. I mean, I think the resistance did. They were important. I mean, I think Marie-Madeline, by alliance by itself, was extraordinarily important. So they did play a role, and to help liberate their own country. Granted, it was not the major role. Obviously, the Allies were it was France was liberated by the Allies, but the French did help.
Well, I think of the words Churchill says when he's facing invasion. He says, the country that fights until the end stands up again. The country that rolls over, is done. And that's the other very important thing, in my opinion, that the French resistance does. It says, no, we fought. We didn't just roll over.
And I think that's important now. I mean, I think it's been important for the French until now, because it hadn't been for the resistance. I mean, they would be left with an indelible stain.
Right.
It still is. There's still a stain there, clearly,
right?
And they can't get away from that. But they did help, restore the honor of their country, the resistance. Marie-Madeline and her people and the other members of the resistance did, in fact, help restore honor and dignity to France.
So I want to just mention, and this is going to be a really long way of getting to a particular question, so feel free to have a drink while I'm working my way up to that. And I should warn you that there is a History Happy Hour drinking game that we play, that anytime we mention the Ghost Army, which I have written about and made a film about, everybody has to have a drink, and so it's coming up. So there is a young woman named Madeline Christensen, whose great-grandfather was in the Ghost Army. Here we go. All right.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
There you go. And she did, for the National History Day, she's 16 years old, and for National History Day this year, she did a project on Marie-Madeline Fourcade, breaking gender barriers behind enemy lines. And one of the things she did in her project, and Madeline's a terrific person. She's also my intern this summer, working remotely from home and probably watching today. So hello, Madeline. And she did, the network was known to the Germans as Noah's Ark, which is also the title of Marie-Madeline Fourcade's memoir, because everybody had animal code names. And in her project, she shows the animals, and then, she reveals who the people are. Well, the question comes from one of the folks in our audience, Marie-Madeline Fourcade. Tell us about her code name and what the significance of it might be.
Yeah, I love the question, and I love the answer.
And let me stop you right there, because Chris, that's two good questions I have this week.
You're winning
right now. So I am totally killing it.
Okay.
All right, go ahead. This is Inside Baseball. Lynn, sorry about that, but you have to deal with it.
I love the Noah's Ark thing, and I love she was the one that came up with the names. She was the one that came up with the idea to name them, give them animal code names, and she was the one that came up, at least with her top people, she came up with their names. And for the guys, she used, it was all these big and important members of the animal kingdom and the bird kingdom, lion, tiger, elephant, eagle. I mean, all the big guys of the animal kingdom. And then for her own name, she chooses hedgehog, which I just loved. I mean, a hedgehog. Actually, I didn't know that much about hedgehogs until I started writing a lot about British history, and I learned a lot about it. Hedgehogs are incredibly important in England, and they're they're these cute little animals that have spines all over their body, and they're the subjects. They're very popular in British children's stories. For in Alice in Wonderland, hedgehogs are used as croquet balls for the Queen of Hearts, and in Peter Rabbit, Beatrix Potter's, one of her favorite characters is this hedgehog named Mrs. Tiggywinkle, which she named after her own pet hedgehogs. And Chris, you probably know this. I had no idea. Hedgehogs are incredibly popular still as pets in England. And I mean, really popular to this day. So the question is, why would this very powerful woman call herself Hedgehog? Well, the thing is that hedgehogs look cute. I mean, they're beguiling. They're really cute, I think. I think they're cute. Anyway, but when they're threatened, they curl up into a tight little ball, and those prickles on their body stick straight out, so that any potential predator, including a lion, is a little hesitant to mess with a hedgehog because they're going to suffer the consequences. And so I think that was part of Marie-Madeline's, idea behind it, that she may look unthreatening as a woman, a young woman, but in fact, she can be just as, threatening to the Germans as a hedgehog is to a lion.
But before Chris asks his next question, I would ask, did she give the guys these code names of important animals to kind of feed their male egos? I mean, what do we think is going on there? You are the lion, you are the tiger. And they're like, yes, I am the lion.
Yeah. There's probably something to be said for that. I mean, I think she was really, again, this goes to her ability to get these guys to fall in line with her, and to follow her. And, she did have this aura of authority. I mean, she expected to be obeyed, but she I just would have loved to have seen her in action, with guys, because they not only respected her, I think they really cared deeply about her. She was really important to them, and so I wouldn't be at all surprised if that wasn't, feed the male ego a little bit, and it worked, I think.
Well, it needs feeding. So let me turn it over here to my incredibly intellectually powerful co-host, Chris Anderson, for the next question.
Well, one very quick one, and you've alluded to it a little bit, but we had a question from my friend Ted, and Ted is interested in the finances and how does the kind of the resistance pay for itself? I mean, I was fascinated. You mentioned in the book at one point the Alliance sets up its own bar. So were all the funds coming from Britain, or were they funding?
Pretty much.
No? Okay.
Yeah, pretty much. MI6 financed the whole thing. And it cost a lot of money. They were because Alliance was so important to them. They spent an enormous amount of money on Alliance, and it would come in. The money would come in usually in various ways, but there was I write in the book about kind of a taxi service, that was run by the RAF. Little planes would fly in from Britain to various landing spots in France, where Alliance landing spots, and these tiny little planes would be carrying money. They would be carrying new equipment like radio sets, and they'd be carrying agents. The agents would go back and forth to London. So it really was a taxi service. In fact, she went to London via this taxi service. So the money was coming in, but it was British money. It was MI6 money. And as I said, I don't really know how much they paid, but they spent an enormous amount.
Oh yeah, I just remember reading the book. You know, a million here, a million there.
Yeah, a million here, a million there, whatever.
Yeah.
And you know, quite frankly, certainly if you were in the top echelon like Marie-Madeline and our other guy, I mean, they'd also send in cigarettes, they'd send in chocolate, they would send in stuff sometimes with
Wow.
they would send in things that nobody had in France. So
Right.
they did get, you know, extra fringe benefits as a result of it too.
So I have a question from Madeline, who I just mentioned, who did the project, the National History Day project. And she says, I really respected that Marie-Madeline and the other women of her organization used their brains and wits to gain information. Marie-Madeline said she was not a Mata Hari. Do you think that the other women in her organization were respected or treated differently?
You know, I'm not sure, Madeline, if she was the one. I think I quoted one of her agents, Jeannie Rousseau, who was one of her big agents. She found out a lot about the V1 and V2 terror weapons that Hitler was developing. She was a young French woman in Paris, and I think she was the one who said it. But you know, I don't know about all the agents, but the female agents, but they were very professional. Certainly Marie-Madeline was. Marie-Madeline never, I mean, she was captured at one point, but she wasn't facing Germans on a day-to-day basis like some of her other agents who were in contact with them as spies. But she was an incredibly professional, an incredible professional, and she insisted that everybody else in her organization, including the women, be that way too. So I don't know, what happened to other agents, but I suspect, I just don't know. Anyway, she and the major agents, the female agents that I know about, did their work without, I think, resorting to sex, although who knows.
My turn, Rick.
Look, I've come up with a new signal. Are you ready?
Oh, okay.
So when I lean back,
Oh, okay.
You could talk.
and when I lean forward, you can interpret. Well, what part of alternating is confusing?
Well, so one of the things I've been curious about since I've been reading your books for so long is that they all, or many of them, pass through London.
Mm-hmm.
And so it must have a particular significance to you. And I'm a little biased because I moved here and I love it here. And this is about my hometown. I was wondering, what is it about London or that period of time that kind of draws you into all these stories?
Well, it really started with, I mentioned to you before we started that London is my favorite city outside. I live in Washington, and actually I love living in Washington, D.C. It's my favorite city, but London next to Washington is my favorite city, and has been since I was very young. But Rick mentioned the first book that I wrote, which was with my husband, called The Murrow Boys. It's about the correspondence that Edward R. Murrow hired to create CBS News before and during the war. And much of the action in that book takes place in London, because that's where Murrow made his name, reporting for CBS. And in doing research about that, we spent a lot of time doing research about London, etc. I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with, there it is. Oh my God, good, yeah.
There you go.
The Murrow Boys. I just fell in love with this city. I fell in love with that time period. I mean, we're talking about the 1940, when it was 1940, 1941 were the kind of the epic, as you know, the epic years for the Brits. I mean, they were the last country standing against Germany. Everybody expected them to fall. In the nick of time, Winston Churchill becomes prime minister and rouses the country to fight back. Nobody thinks they're going to be able to win. They have the Blitz, the Battle of Britain. It's just such an incredibly dramatic, exciting time. And as I said, I just fell in love with the story, and I also fell in love with the city. And after doing that book, and then I wrote several other books before the book that I'm going to mention in a minute, I wanted to do a book about London during the war. I just thought it was just such an amazing place during the war. It was, I think, the most exciting place to be in the world during World War II. So I wrote a book called Citizens of London, which is about the Anglo-American Alliance, but it really focuses on London during the war. There it is.
I'm a fanboy. What can I tell you?
So, you know, for basically that's why I just, and then, you know, if you focus on a period of you know, a period, then you find out things about every book. You find out something new, and then you think, oh my, that would make an interesting book, and so that leads you to the next one and the next one and the next one. So virtually all the books that I've written 8 books, as Rick said, but 7 of them have been about, in some way, about Britain and World War II, including this book. I mean, there's a lot about Britain in it, and I've gotten the ideas from previous books. I mean, that's one of the good side effects of writing about focusing on one particular time period and one particular event. So that's really, and I still have, I mean, I may have run out of books to write about England and World War II, but I'm still.
Oh, no. We'll talk later.
Bring on some ideas.
We have only, I mean, technically we have only about 30 seconds left, but let's just forget about that because time's not that important. We can go a tiny bit long, but we don't want to impinge on you too much. I only have 73 other questions left on my list. But I'm going to skip my list because someone asks us, they said, please tell the story about her being captured. And I would say, don't tell all of it, because you should buy the book, but give it, when was she captured? And obviously, I mean, perhaps people don't know, obviously, but she did survive being captured, but she faced her own personal moment with the Gestapo, didn't she?
Yeah, she did. She was captured twice during the war. The second time was after D-Day. She'd been in England until after D-Day. She'd been there almost a year, and came back and went to Aix-en-Provence in the south of France, and she was captured there by the Gestapo. They knew she was a spy. They did not know she was Marie-Madeline Fourcade, who they were after. But so she was taken to a military barracks in Aix, downtown Aix, and put into a jail cell, just a military jail cell. And the following morning, the head of the Gestapo from Marseille was going to come to Aix, and she knew that once he came, they would find out who she was, and that, you know, she knew that probably torture was in the cards, and that she didn't think she was afraid that she would not be able to withstand the torture, and so she considered actually killing herself at that point. But then she thought, no, that if she killed herself, that the network would then die along with her. So she decided to try to think of a way to escape. And I'll make this very short. It goes on much longer, but it was a very hot night in Aix. It was July. It was sultry hot. She was covered in sweat, not only because of the heat, but because she was terrified. And she remembered a story that her father told her in Shanghai about Chinese robbers who would strip themselves naked and cover themselves with oil to be able to get in through the bars of, you know, gates and windows of the houses that they wanted to rob. And so with that in mind, she went to the window. There was only one window in the jail cell. Keep in mind, it was not a Gestapo jail cell because she wouldn't have been able to do what she was able to do. But anyway, it's just an ordinary jail cell, and there was no glass. It was just a window with bars. And she noticed that 2 bars were a little bit wider than the other bars. So what she did, to make a long story short, is she took off all her clothes, put her dress, her summer dress, in between her teeth, managed to get up, and she was very slight, she's very slender. She managed to get her body through those bars. It was a long, complicated process, and it was terrifying on her part. But the upshot was that she jumped down. She was naked. She crawled across the street on her hands and knees with the dress still in between her teeth, got across, put on her dress, and made her way back to Paris. It's an amazing story. And it's all true. I mean, it's just,
wow.
It's just stunning.
Wow.
And you can, there's a picture in the book, a photo of her at, where if you look very carefully, she's got bruises all over. She's got bruises all over her face and all over her neck. But, talk about presence of mind. Ooh.
Lynne, if only this were a 2-hour show, we'd have so many more questions to ask you. But when's the movie coming out? I think is the one that everybody would like to know.
Well, there are discussions going on.
Sure.
It's one thing that one finds when something's optioned, it takes forever. So I can't say anything yet.
No, of course not.
As long as Rick's got to portray Navarre, I think.
Okay, it's a deal.
No, I think I'll be some old Frenchman. But Lynne Olsen, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour. And this has been absolutely amazing and fantastic. So we really appreciate your being here. We're going to drop you out now to finish our show. If you want to hang around and say hello to us at the end, you can. And if you need to go someplace else, that's also good. But thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It really was fun.
Good.
We've had many comments of people who've read your book, who appreciate your being here, who are delighted to hear from you. So thank you so much.
You guys take care. Thanks.
Cheers. Okay, and we're back from that Encore episode. And Chris, we also have we have a bunch of live episodes coming up. I promise.
We
We're not taking another week off, except for maybe Thanksgiving, until Christmas. So, Chris, what is the show coming up next week? It's a place you've been to many times. Tell us a little bit about it.
It's about Hill 400, which is one of the last fights in the Hurtgen Forest. And if you aren't aware, Hurtgen Forest was probably one of the most miserable battles Americans fought in Europe during World War II. And this particular battle is going to focus on the 2nd Ranger Battalion, which, again, most people know an awful lot about for their participation in Pointe du Hoc, but they know almost nothing about their fight at Hill 400. And it was a fight that the veterans always told me was much worse than D-Day. They would call the fight at Hill 400 their longest day. So it's a new book just about this forgotten fight, and really looking forward to it.
All right. So we'll see you next week. Keep living, keep learning.
Keep eating soup waffles. Bye.